What happens when the journeys of customers, technology, and business intersect? Product happens. Welcome to Product Management Show, where we talk about the journeys of customers, the journeys of technology, and the journeys of business, and what happens when they all intersect at the crossroads we call product.
What would you say you do here? You take the specifications from the customers and you bring them down to the software engineers. Yes, that's right.
I'm working, so why don't you go do whatever it is a product manager does?
When you think about focusing, right? You think, well, focusing is saying yes, no. Focusing is about saying no. Focusing is about saying no. And you've got to say no, no, no. And when you say no, you piss off people.
You just begin. You do the math. You solve one problem. Then you solve the next one. And then the next. And if you solve enough problems, you get to come home.
Welcome to part 2 of Prioritization, Algorithmic or Stakeholder Consensus.
This episode brought to you by Under 10 Playbook, a cloud-based software solution with on-site workshops that ensure your team is systematic in their methods and consistent in their deliverables. From business planning to product launch, Under 10 Playbook is the ultimate smart notebook for managing software products, empowering you to work smarter and collaborate better with development and marketing teams.
With the humorous debate behind us in part 2, let's have a more serious discussion on this very critical topic for product people. What is the best way to prioritize new features for our products? For this discussion, we welcome back Rich Mironov. Rich coaches product executives, product teams, and agile dev shops. He also parachutes into software companies as interim Fix-It VP of Product. Rich has consulted to more than 100 tech companies and is a favorite of the product blogosphere and conference circuit. Welcome, Rich Mironov.
Great, thanks. Wonderful to be here.
And we also welcome back Steve Johnson, fondly known as the godfather of product management. Most people know Steve from his many years at Pragmatic Marketing. Currently, Steve hails from Under 10 Consulting, where his goal is to turn product managers into product leaders. In his spare time, Steve enjoys making music at notexactlysteve.com. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And rounding out our panel for this discussion is our resident student of product management, Neeha Tummala. Welcome back, Neeha. All right.
Thank you.
Oh, there you are. All right, so let's jump right in. Rich, in our debate in part 1, you argued that stakeholder consensus was critical in effectively prioritizing new features and requirements. Has this been your experience with the tech companies you've consulted with? And why do you think consensus is so important?
Yeah, I think it really is important, and let me just highlight, I don't expect to get agreement, but I do expect the various stakeholders to buy into enough process and agreement that we can get something done. So waiting for an executive team, especially a really confused or broken one, to all vote together is hopeless. But I think we've got to take into account that if everybody on the executive team comes out empty from some prioritization exercise, they're simply going to overturn it, spill all the tiles on the floor, and start again. So that's really important. Underneath that, I usually hear two kinds of root issues. The one is, and Steve called it out in our humor section before, short attention span. Most of the leadership at a tech company can't remember what's currently being worked on in engineering. And so when they get a good idea, they reach down inside and assume nobody's working on anything, and so that their good idea is something that should run to the front of the list. So critical, I think, for product managers to have in their hands at every moment of every day the list of things that are currently important and being worked on, so they can ask, instead of the "is it a good idea" question, is your good idea a better idea than the 5 things we're actually working on?
Okay, thanks, Rich. That's great. So, Steve, has this been your experience as well, or do you have a different perspective? Because in the debate, you took the side of algorithmic prioritization. So, is that what you've seen as an effective way to work?
Well, yeah, and I want to agree with my my partner here. If you're at a company with dozens of products, it's quite reasonable that executives can't remember what things we talked about last week because they've heard 12 different stories of that. Having a tool of some kind that articulates, here's what we've agreed to, here's our status report, if you will, here's our roadmap, and reminding them of the decisions we made last month is always a helpful way of keeping everybody aligned. But furthermore, yeah, I remember years ago I had a case where one of my developers said, we've got to go offline for a year to refactor and re-architect. And I went, well, there's no way I'm going to get that along. And as Rich pointed out, everybody's looking for their thing or whatever. And I've always tried to organize launches around 4 major features. One that will really jazz the executives, one that will jazz the sales team, one that development really needs, like refactoring or re-architecting, and one that will screw with the competition. And it seems to me that the algorithmic approach doesn't really speak to, here's something that'll make the executives happy, here's something that'll make the salespeople and the buyers happy. But it's a good approach of just saying, here's what I'm working with. Show me, as Rich pointed out, show me why new idea du jour is more important than the stuff that's already on my plate.
Okay, no, that's great. Although I love your example, and in fact, the way you described it, I thought that could almost be an algorithm. One of these, and one of those, and one of those, and one of those.
Right.
There you go.
Yeah, and to lean in a second, because I have a pie chart model I use a lot, and the goal of the pie chart is to say that a piece of the pie is for one set of things that you can compare to each other that are similar. So you might have one part of the pie, which is where we throw all of the individual revenue-driving single small features that fit within our existing products, right? Mm-hmm. And by isolating them from the other stuff, you can say, well, which of our many possible single small features that are going to compete with each other for revenue are the best ones, without, for instance, giving away 100% of the engineering effort away from tech debt. And you throw the tech debt things into some other pie slice and say, well, of all the possible tech debt we could retire, which ones are going to make our engineering team fastest or reduce the number of tickets? Because we can only spend 15% of our engineering budget on reducing tech debt. Mm-hmm. So let's not try to trade off one more bit of tech debt against one more bit of revenue, because when we invite the executive team in the room, they're always going to vote for revenue, and we're never going to work on tech debt.
Very good point.
Got it.
Very good point.
Yeah, great point, Rich. So Neeha, let's get you in here. So you're representing the practitioner for us, right? So what are you currently using for prioritization of features and feature requests? Do you have some kind of scoring algorithm or something, or do you listen to stakeholders, etc.?
It's a little bit of a crazy mess of all of the above. So from an input perspective, I do try to have a rough, quick and dirty scoring mechanism, which is basically looking at urgency, which is user determined, and importance, trying to balance those two. And then the other perspective is revenue and gross margin. So minimizing or maximizing the other two. So these 4 factors is what I currently use. But having said that, I have a problem of like garbage input, garbage output, right? When it comes to these sorts of scoring things, which is, when you're looking at like a bunch of features and most of these are sort of submitted or they come in through some mechanism. And if they aren't properly staked out in terms of urgency, importance, detail, requirements, then I find that, no matter how much scoring I do, it's not quite there. And that's when actually the voices of the stakeholders comes in, and it's about like who's screaming the most or who's escalated the most. And so like at the input level, I do try to have some order just to sort of ensure that everything is laid out on the table. But along the way, it's the voices of the stakeholders that ultimately sort of determine for me as to what gets done. But there's a ton of factors. So balancing it out between like time to market versus like what is strategic and also, I would say the last bit is just ensuring that maybe the 10% or 20% is just allocated to, the efficiency stuff, because if all towards just prioritization, that bucket would just never get done.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. So I'm just curious, not that you have to answer, but we talk about voice of the stakeholder, but we don't talk about volume of the stakeholder at any point. Okay, so speaking of stakeholders, Steve, maybe you can help us clarify the term. So we talk about stakeholder consensus. So who are the stakeholders that product managers should look to satisfy? And then, how should they balance those different stakeholders? Are they all equal, or should they weigh them differently?
Well, the weighting factor, I think, has a lot to do with where you are in the stage of growth of your product. Are you in the nail it phase or the scale it phase? But when I think of stakeholders, I'm typically thinking of the executive team. I'm fairly famous for having little respect for the input from salespeople. I love working with salespeople, but I don't consider them to be particularly strategic. And so as I think of stakeholders, I typically am thinking of the leadership team, the sales team, the development team, and the support team. A group that is woefully underrepresented, I think, in most product decisions. Rich, do you want to add something?
Sure, I do. I think I'm reaching way back to the early 80s here for the original Tron movie, when Tron said, "We fight for the users."
Yes.
Right? So I know I've failed in this entire exercise if I'm giving various stakeholders, internal executives, what they want because they're internal executives, right? The best outcome of this exercise is we've figured out what things are really going to help the customers, the users, the buyers, right? The users and choosers. But we're able to sort those into different buckets that satisfy some of the folks. So, for instance, you called out, I think correctly, that support almost never has a voice here. Well, we know that customers are frustrated, that users are frustrated when the experience is bad, or there's too many steps, or we've given them bad help, or they fail out all the time. And that comes to us as support. We know we have to fix those because they're for our customers, but I want to also fix those because it makes the life of our online support team better, right? So to some extent, this is a lot about figuring out what we need to do and identifying which of the executive stakeholders go with each thing, and then making sure nobody went away hungry. So of course, sales is excited because we put some new features out or some new products out that people are going to pay for. And that's great because that drives the business. But we can't let support go hungry. We can't let engineering go without some investment in quality and systems and DevOps and all the things we got to do. And so there's some shaving of the pie here to make sure that we're putting the right emphasis in the right places. And then as much as anything else for me, it's dressing up the right answer, which is the good customer answer, in a way that everybody on the executive team feels like they got something they really wanted.
Very good point. And I want to restate what you said in a different way, or what I said in a different way. I'm less interested in feedback from my colleagues and more interested in feedback from the market. So when I think about, sales as a stakeholder, I think of them as proxies for the buyer. And when I think about support, I think of them as proxies for the user. Development is, I need to encourage both user and buyer focus in the world of development, but we also have to deal with, there are things that we can do to make it easier for us to deliver better product in the future to our customers. So my orientation is always going to be looking at it first through the lens of buyers and users.
I think that's right. And I spend a lot of my time on the enterprise side, where sales teams may only have one client or customer. And so you can always guarantee that they will, repeat whatever the customer has said or whatever the executive at the customer has said, but they'll attribute that to the whole market. So the Citicorp team will say, well, everybody in the banking world needs X. Of course, they don't talk to anybody else. Back in the old hardware days, we used to say that sales reps had a stack depth of 1, which meant they only remembered the last meeting they were in, and whenever you get them, it's kind of random.
Neeha, what would you say as you reflect on the real world you live in? Who are the stakeholders you primarily deal with or primarily support?
For me, it's absolutely the C-suite. Everybody, actually. It's the account managers, it's sales folks, it's support, customer support folks, pretty much everyone in the organization. But I have to say, I absolutely agree with the both of you in terms of market feedback. I think that's one way to just cut out the noise and not just prioritize, but also to, sort of cut through the layers of, or this is what we want, and have a slightly more like evidence-based approach to decision making. And market. So I try to look at all of the various voices that are speaking to me in these various roles and understand who is closer to market in terms of feedback, accuracy. And sometimes, it's almost like, for me, it's nice if you can even cut out everybody and just get it straight from the user, even if it is enterprise. That way you can sort of validate, what, if the feedback that's coming in makes sense. And it's especially useful when you need to push back and say that actually you're wrong, So I try to use a lot of these stakeholders and I guess information that's coming in from various sources to also kind of pitch people against each other to really see where the source of truth is, if at all any,
Good. And some context here, I think, because I think we're having very much the enterprise discussion where there's a small number of accounts and there's a lot of politics around those things. That's my side of the world. I think the folks in the consumer side of the world have been doing this right for a couple of decades. If you've got 20 million or 50 million people who are using your e-commerce site, you really do run experiments. And if you lose a couple of sales of some product that's worth $9, honestly, that's okay, because you're trying to optimize the whole system. And so I think the consumer folks have been, a decade or two ahead of those of us who are coming at this in an enterprise model, where if we lose the GM account or the AT&T account this quarter, everybody has to go home fired, is pretty different than we need to sell 20 million Fitbits this year.
Yeah.
Good one.
Yeah, that's good. Neeha, so I think you have a few questions that you wanted to ask. Can you share those now?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the first one is, how often do you refresh priorities? Because I know we talk about prioritization, but things keep changing and it's sort of crazy. So how do you, find the balance between, refreshing often, or do you stick to your guns and say, no, this is the cadence at which we will be refreshing priority?
Boy, I hate to say continuously, but that feels like reality. What is nice about a lot of the approaches we have in development today is we have this long list of things that we're planning. And many of those things have gone through a grooming process that they're actually ready for development. And that queue of work can be continuously prioritized. But certainly, every time development comes to me and says, dude, I'm idle, what do you want me to work on? I've got this big queue of stuff that's ready for work, and it can be adjusted in real time. Where I think we get into a lot of trouble is where we say, okay, I've already handed work to development, but our priorities have changed, and I want to take that work back. That is very disruptive. But if we've got 20 things in the queue waiting for development bandwidth, and a massive bug comes in or a massive deal comes in, we can always make that the number one priority. So I think of it as a fairly frequent reprioritization exercise.
Yeah, I might take the other side of that, which is I'm trying to remember the last time any developer came to me and said, "Dude, I've got nothing to work on." Right? I think I was writing COBOL, and it was 1981. But so I'm always worried on the other side of shaking the box too often. So if I've got a team that's on a 1 week sprint model or something, or they turn around good work every week. Honestly, I want to give them 2 or 3 or 4 days to get something done, and that my nose is always up for how do I minimize wasted time and frustration on the part of my development team. So
Absolutely,
I'm almost always going to say something to almost every new idea if it's not a P0 system down, or it's not the largest deal we're going to do this year. My answer is almost always, let me take that under advisement and we'll think about it for next week. Right? Because I really want my development team to feel valued and protected and defended, like they can get something effing done this week instead of being jerked around. Because here in San Francisco, there's 27 other jobs on the same floor of whatever building we're on if they're unhappy.
Yeah. No, Steve, sorry, Rich, I like your answer. I was going to just paraphrase in a really brutal way Albert Einstein, and I think you should reprioritize as often as necessary, but no more often.
But no more often, that's right.
That's right.
And for me, that's, are we getting real work done every week? If we're not getting good real work done and we're not happy with our throughput here, then the first place I look is whether we're changing our mind so fast that we don't finish anything. And then it's my job to throw my body on the tracks and slow down all the craziness and hold it back so my team will get some work done and feel good and let me buy them pizza at the end of the week.
Yeah, that was my requirements aging story earlier.
Yes.
I went to the leadership team and said, you guys just need to shut up for weeks at a time. If you've got an idea, bring it to me. And at the time, we had development on one floor and sales, marketing, and executives on a different floor. And I paid the security guy like $50 to reprogram the floor access key so no one from sales, marketing, or the executive team could get onto the development floor. If you've got an idea, come to me. I'll put it in the queue. It may be the most important thing that I give to development next, but nobody should be screwing with people who are doing actual work.
Yeah, makes sense.
I'm with that, yep.
Yep. All right. Another one that I had was for startups, what should some prioritization drivers be? Because I know that in my own algorithms, I rattled off a bunch of different inputs like urgency and time to market, et cetera. But what do you think kind of like the top few drivers should be for startups?
Let me lean in on this one. I think, the number one challenge of startups, if they're still trying to prove out the market or find out if their product really works, is to find out if their product really works. So I'd be listening really, really hard to those first 3 or 4 customers and seeing if we can turn on a dime so the dreamy, wonderful text that the marketing people put on the website has some relation to what we're shipping. Pretty often we've convinced ourselves we've got something and it just doesn't work.
Okay.
Agreed.
So, that would be validation as opposed to revenue, you'd say.
Well, so you don't get up the revenue curve until you've got 3 customers that are going to refer you in as not sucking, right? So, right? Who are going to, be willing to let their names go out to a few folks quietly and get on the phone and say, yeah, it did the thing it was supposed to do. So, revenue be damned. Let's get $1 from them so that it's actual revenue, but let's give the last $50,000 worth away in order to convince them to use the stuff. So until we're at 4 or 5 or 6 customers, man, it's all about a little happiness and not about the revenue.
I've mentioned it before, but Saeed has a metaphor that I just love, and that is you need to learn it before you build it, and you need to nail it before you scale it. And my prioritization scheme would take that into account. What Rich was just saying is brilliant. We can't scale it until we've learned it enough to know that we've built the right thing. And so those early adopter customers are not about revenue. They're about proof of concept. And then when we've proven our concept and we're in the scaling, then our prioritization should shift to revenue related stuff. How can we increase our growth? Maybe there's a small feature that doesn't do anything, but it makes a flashy light and that makes salespeople happy, or it makes customers happy. Cool. We want to take on a lot of small work in the growth phase, so that we are continually improving the product. But then, towards the end of days, once you've achieved scale and you're now at an established product, then the prioritization scheme changes again. And now it's more about cost reduction. How do we reduce the cost of goods sold? How do we reduce the cost of goods? How do we reduce our support time? And suddenly revenue is not really the issue anymore. It's maintaining our market share. And so depending on where your product is in its life cycle, you'll emphasize different things.
Yeah, actually, just on that point, thanks for referencing that, Steve. I think this is where the debate needs to broaden beyond just features and products and dev, because really, yes, you're building something, but how you prioritize really depends on what your objectives are. And so your objectives from a product perspective have to be beyond the software, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you're looking to scale, then what are the things that you need to do, not just in the product, but in the company for scalability? And I think that's an important thing that product managers need to understand, is that, when they're looking at the product, it's product success overall, not product software success, if that makes sense. And so I think you need to get a bigger holistic.
To me, it's so funny that we in this business, when we say product, almost everybody hears us say software. And yet these techniques are applicable to services, and more than that, they're applicable to the ecosystem that the software lives in. So I didn't say software, I said product, and product is the marketing, it's the support, it's the sales, it's the software.
Yeah, good. So we're in agreement.
Yeah, spot on. I can't tell you how many engineers I work with, how many developers who believe that the bits that they ship, or that we ship, are the product. It's like, well, no, it's a steaming heap of code until we can tell a good story about it, explain what it's for, figure out who the target audience is, and have some buyer part with some money in order to try it out.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Here's another one. If a team wanted to, let's say my team, wanted to set up a prioritization algorithm or take a stab at it, what would you suggest? How would a team set one up? And do you guys have any examples that you could share?
So there's a really basic spreadsheet that I've used a bunch of times. It actually is owned by Steve, and it's on his website. And it's his really basic thing. It's
called quick prioritization.
Quick prioritization. I think it's under 10playbook.com/article/prioritization, but it's his quick prioritization spreadsheet. And there's animals on the left. It's got like hippos and lions and stuff where you put project names. It's got about 4 columns. Beyond 4 columns, I think nobody can understand it. And I always point people towards Steve's because it doesn't pretend to be deep 6-digit value science where we're going to have AI and black ops doing stuff. It's just like give them some scores, see what comes up to the top, and then apply good judgment to the top 20%.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I would say something similar, Neeha, is simply, if you want to create your own spreadsheet, is just ask yourselves, what's important to you? What are things that are important, right? So some companies might prioritize based on revenue, or others might prioritize based on customer satisfaction or technical debt or other things. So figure out what the 3 or 4 things are that are important to you, and figure out how important they are. So maybe you put a little weighting on each, and then go through exactly what Rich said, use it, and then apply judgment. If the numbers don't really make sense, adjust it, and then until they do make sense. And it might not give you all the answers, but it might help you narrow down where your focus should be.
And the
nice. That's really
thing about prioritization the thing about prioritization is we're trying to choose an order. First do this, then do this, then do that. And a lot of times people turn this into a feature level cost justification. How many dollars is this going to cost us to build, and how many revenue dollars will it generate? And that level of precision is just crap. There's no accuracy to it at all. What we're really looking for is, this is more important than that.
Spot on.
Yeah, makes sense. And just a last one, which is, what can a team learn after each round of prioritization? So in other words, should a team be getting better at it every time?
I hope they're not getting worse at it every time. So,
well, I don't think the team gets better or worse. I think what happens is they refine the algorithm.
Yeah.
And I think also, I think they get better at throwing away the outliers, right? So the first couple of times you have a list of 50 things, everybody wants to look at every one of the 50 and spend an equal 10 minutes on each. And then you're into next Thursday before you're done. A couple of rounds in, you've got some general consensus around what things don't make any sense and don't need to be, unearthed. And you can move everybody quickly to the 20 or 30% that matter, because if we're pushing it to the bottom half of the list, we're not getting to it in this decade anyway.
Yeah. Well, one thing we haven't mentioned, and not to sort of take the discussion in a different direction, but this discussion of algorithms and so on, it's not the only thing you do, right? You start with objectives. What are our goals? What are our objectives? Why are we doing this? Let's understand those things first. Let's maybe drill down a bit. What are the themes for a release? Which basically says what you're going to focus on versus what you're not going to focus on. And then eventually after that, and you all agree on that, then you can say, okay, based on all of that, what do we really think is important? And I think at that point, you might not even need an algorithm because you've already done the hard work.
That's right. Spot on.
I think, so in that case, Steve, you're completely wrong on algorithms. No, but I think that's really the discussion you need to have, right? Is, and that goes back to my point earlier about what's important. And once you all agree on what's important, then you know what's not important, and then you can just focus.
+1.
Yeah.
+1.
Okay. So Neeha, thank you very much for those questions. That was great. We're coming up to the end, so let's move on and wrap up discussion. So Rich, do you have any final thoughts or takeaways you want to give the listeners?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. I guess my final thought would be, you really should have an algorithm, and you really should have some analytics here. Just don't expect all of the less analytic people in the company, which is almost everybody else, to go along with it because you're being analytical. You've got to think about your audience and how you sell the goodness. And often that's not about showing them the details of how cool your algorithm is.
All right. Thanks, Rich. And Steve, final words from you?
Yeah, let me agree with Rich in a different way. The different people we deal with have different learning needs. Developers like to dig into the data, and showing them, an algorithmic approach to prioritization will probably be well received. Salespeople, on the other hand, would want to hear what stories go with those priorities. Here's the feedback we got from the market. Here's what customer A said. Here's what customer B said. And the idea of having allocations in your budget for, here's something that moves us forward strategically. This is something that appeals to buyers. This is something that appeals to users. This is something that helps us with our infrastructure, is a way of getting everybody to see that you've got their backs. As a product manager, we're supposed to be data driven, but I think what we've said today is we want to be data informed. But at the end of the day, there's a judgment call, and the stakeholders need to have confidence in your judgment.
Got it. Great. All right, so this has been a really interesting discussion on prioritization. So thanks again, Rich, Steve, and Neeha for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been really educational. Rich, before we sign off, how can listeners get a hold of you or contact you?
My name's hard to spell, so let me spell it out. It's Miron, N as in Nancy, O, V as in Victory, and I'm Rich at Mironov.com.
All right, great. Thanks, Rich. And Steve, you have a very confusing name, so maybe you can help us.
Indeed. Well, first of all, you can come check out my article, Quick Prioritization, that we mentioned earlier, but feel free to email me at steve@under10consulting, steve@under10consulting.com.
All right, great. Thanks again, Steve. All right, so let's say thank you again to folks, and good night, everyone. Take care.
Thanks. It's a pleasure.
Brought to you by Under 10 Playbook.
You can find us on the web at www.productmanagementshow.com and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at The PDM Show. That's THEPDMSHOW.
Gee, Ray, what do you want to do tonight?
The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
Thank you for listening to the Product Management Show. If you enjoy the show, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.